So I'm the Digital Insights Leader at Aurecon. I've got with me Nick Williams, Digital Practice Leader, and Richard Syme, one of our senior GIS consultants. So between the three of us, I guess we'll be telling some of the story of Aurecon's digital transformation and journey into this exciting and emerging new landscape, which we've framed under the moniker of Digital Futures. So we're part of the Digital Futures team that's really seeking to, I guess, capture the possibilities that we're now beginning to see before us with emerging technologies, and beginning to translate those possibilities throughout the business and ultimately into client services, really to leverage the potential that's out there before us as an industry. So you would have heard a little bit today about this evolving landscape and some of the potential that comes with it. Certainly the ways in which we can start to appreciate the value and the potential that exists within the masses and masses of data that we come across, that we collect through our ordinary business practices across engineering and construction, and even internal business processes. It's valuable to appreciate, though, that it's very easy to get, I guess, lost a little bit in the hype, to perceive this as not just emerging, but overwhelming, potentially, rolling along faster than we can keep up. So the first thing we can do is really seek to understand, some of the terminology that we're working with, to really get a handle on what's at the essence of it, so that we can better put it to use. And very simply, even the term digital, has many different connotations, and is used in a variety of ways, from really systems and processes which can be optimized on the basis of a given platform in the digital domain on which that particular business process is reliant, through to driving efficiencies in engineering practices and construction practices. In other circles, taking more of a futurist bent, it can connotate the, I guess, transforming landscape, which may, completely upend the way in which we work, the way in which we not just utilise tools, but ultimately deliver our services. Then you start to get into that domain of automation and what that looks like for an industry. Importantly, though, we like to kind of come back to the essence of really digital being used as an adjective rather than a noun. So we don't go digital, we don't become digital, but rather we apply systems and methodologies that leverage some kind of digital process or digital capability. So in mapping out that landscape, there's a number of capabilities which we already see around us, being utilised in different industries, and things which are seemingly on the horizon or just over the horizon. So many within this room, I'm sure, are already familiar with BIM as a methodology and a process within this industry. GIS, which Richard will expand on. Again, a number of these systems and processes have already been in place. They're already well established, in the landscape. What we're seeing, though, is the opportunity to be able to extend the way we work within those systems and ultimately what those systems offer for us. Most of our organisations have, some aspect of their back-end systems running in the cloud. So the kind of flexibility that offers us really impacts upon the way in which we work, the way in which we not only handle data and information, but the way in which we're able to share it. As we continue to move through that landscape and really bring in capabilities from other domains, we can start to change what it is that we're actually offering by really diving into the data and extracting what is inherent within there, but maybe not accessible in the way in which we're currently utilising it. So that brings us to concepts like machine learning, which is in reality not necessarily far-fetched. It's a domain well established within electronics engineering and computer science, reliant on fundamental mathematical processes and algorithms. The advancement of computing resources simply makes those kinds of techniques more viable and more applicable. We're now starting to see also new forms of communication and visualization of information and data and practices that, as you'll see shortly, have an impact also on the way in which we work and the way in which we're able to engage with a broader demographic of people within our industry. So a lot of this stuff isn't just for the techies, it's not just for the engineers, but it slowly breaks down those barriers which bring more people to the table, which hopefully ultimately will facilitate greater collaboration and sharing of ideas. So I think one thing to bear in mind, and this is towards maybe allaying some of those fears around digital disruption that we're observing in many industries. We have the standard use cases of Uber and whatnot. And certainly the capabilities now that we're exploring and developing and deploying as well, have the potential to disrupt our industry as well. And there's two ways in which we can kind of, respond to that. And, it's almost a philosophical one. Do we want to perceive it as a disruptive process or an opportunity to actually take that capability and apply it in a constructive fashion from the outset? So we're seeing how these kinds of technologies are changing, the way we live and the way we work, just by the sheer availability of devices and platforms, which make it, greatly more accessible than it has been at any point in the past. So it's really with us to determine how we leverage these capabilities, how we implement them, and how we utilise them. So in that regard, we're at a time now where we don't necessarily need to be reactive. We don't need to sit back and wait for these capabilities to be thrust upon us or to be dictated, by external stakeholders. But we, I think, still have an opportunity at this point in time to shape how these kinds of capabilities filter through our organisations and ultimately to our clients in a way that's, I think, satisfactory for multiple stakeholders. So what we'll talk through is a few case studies that demonstrate that we're already able to deliver solid and tangible outcomes. So yes, it's still emerging, but it's already present, it's already active, and it's already offering great benefit. So in terms of digital inertia, well, what's the right time to really embark on this journey? What's the right time for your organisation to step into this space? Now is as good as any. I think we have a kind of, there's maybe a cultural element within Australia that likes to see, even from the ideas that are developed here, wait for them to be demonstrated elsewhere for us to realise how valuable they are. Well, I don't think we necessarily need to wait for that to happen. We're already undertaking that development and that exploration to demonstrate that capability and the value and the viability. So it's a journey. It may be a long one, but it's going to be a continually evolving one. So I think it's just a question of stepping in at any point, because not only will the technological possibilities continue to evolve, so will your organisation and the way you leverage these. I think a key message to really take away too is that it's not about the technology. And again, this comes to how you choose to adopt it, how you choose to shape it, but also how you determine that it will shape your practice and your organisation. And our approach is to really have a human-centred objective at the heart of all of that. So it's not just tech platforms and tech solutions that are adopted wholesale, but really through, I guess, a design-led approach, seeking first to understand the needs of the client as the centerpiece. So not just pushing on a new service or a new capability, but first seeking to understand what are their genuine needs. And then letting the technology, letting the digital tools and that digital story really serve as a facilitator for arriving at that better outcome for them, but not only for them. So for all stakeholders involved. So I guess that begins by really, not just understanding the client need, but as we apply this to engineering and construction practices, understanding the way we work now. In order to then determine, well, okay, how might these emerging tools and capabilities, facilitate some of those processes, enhance them, improve that efficiency, or even generate an entirely new offering. This is what I was going to finish with, but I can touch upon it now. And again, it's not about the technology. It's about the people. So as a story of digital transformation, for that genuinely to take root, there needs to be uptake, there needs to be buy-in. Because ultimately, it's that human resource that utilises those digital capabilities as a toolkit, not an end game, that really ensures you have the best opportunity for leveraging those possibilities, for adopting a better practice. So I'll hand over to Nick now, who's going to, I guess, take us through a number of case studies, largely focusing on aspects of computational design. But what you'll see here too is, I guess, that medium of visualization and utilization of advanced computational resources in order to better engage, to better communicate not just a single idea, but a multitude of ideas, and to be able to communicate those in a way that's, I guess, better digested by the recipients and other stakeholders. So in that way, sets us off on that journey of collaboration that extends not just, within a single team in the same domain, but, across a whole project. All of the stakeholders involved in that particular delivery. So I'll hand over to Nick.
Thanks, Simon. So, look, as a digital practice leader, I work across all our markets and delivery groups in our Melbourne and Adelaide offices. And Slaven asked me to put a few things together for this. He said, I'll talk a bit about BIM, and I can pull out examples from projects. We've been on a 7-year journey of having 3D models driving our projects. There's varying degrees of information behind them. from stadiums, so focusing on structure through services. I'll put my hand up and say, I do come from a building space. I'm an architect by training. But what I want to talk in a bit more detail about is not our application of BIM, and obviously this is evolving, and we don't actually use the term. We're sort of slowly evolving to use the term information modelling so to talk less about the buildings itself and these models across markets. And I should say, we've now built BIM capability, modelling capability across the firm of about 700. We're actually getting different images on these too. There's a map behind there, not just New Zealand. So it's not just the Kiwis. So we now have this sort of grunt that the firm has built, and a lot of our competitors have done similar things. And we're shifting to opportunities around the field of computational design. And this is the background I come from. I'm an architect by training who's been writing code for the last 10 years. And it's a term that's quite new to the engineering firm. It's still a field that's pretty in its infancy. This pavilion down the bottom is one that was built earlier in the year by a drone flying between two robots. It's a prepreg carbon fibre pavilion. And this community of computational design has sort of grown around phenomena like parametric modelling, coding for design. So how do we start to write little scripts to automate things we do? And a culture of prototyping. So not just prototyping digitally, but also physically as systems like this. So this 27-metre cantilever here is an example of that. So this is many people have talked about the fact that it's not the technology, it's the people. And this community around computational design has grown in Europe and North America quite healthily over the last decade. And I spent plenty of time over there, and it's now there's now sort of computational design degrees emerging in Australia, and certainly a skill set that's required. So I'll talk through a little bit about what that means for us at Aurecon and a few of the examples this year. At the heart of computational design is that sort of ability to understand data at the centre of our practice, so being able to interrupt model data. So this is a model of a stadium, and this one was actually being driven through a Tekla model rather than another BIM platform. And for us, the key was to get it into our analysis package, and this was taking some time, not based on just on a file format. It's not just a sort of export-import problem, but it's a cleaning up problem. How do we tease out the bits of information we need for structural analysis? So we built a series of scripts that ran workflows to pull together elements such as trusses, which are close to planar, make sure they are planar, where there are duplicate elements, etc., start to clean those out, and take that down to a process of just a couple of minutes with a user interface on it. So this is a custom tool. So talked about tools, but this is a culture of tool makers and not just tool users. So we have various bits of software within the business, and we need to customize across those and within those. So clean model. A process like our daylighting studies on buildings have been very manual, and we're starting to get people to understand that a lot of these systems we can test across matrices of types. So start to test across shading strategy. So this becomes a parametric shading strategy, and let's just roll out a series of tests. So this is an example of a project where we've looked at 5 different floor plates and 10 different shading strategies, and based on an exposure level criteria, we're able to start to identify what works better. And we run these on a virtual computer, parallel process it. So what was taking days to do manually for a couple of simulations, take a couple of days, we're doing in a matter of about 45 minutes and getting a result pumped back to us. Similarly, we do a lot of manual work around something like geotech, where we need to process images. So here we have photos of boreholes. I'm sure people are familiar with these. Many of you in the room will have come across these, but we need to identify types of rock, and this is done simply visually. And engineers don't realise that architects pull colour information off images all the time to make complex facades and this sort of thing. So quickly set that up to run a series of scripts over these images and pull out where rock and matrix were, and provide tools. So we also have been getting into some of the fabrication work. 3D printing's been long talked about. I'm not an evangelist of 3D printing. I actually don't think it's going to, I think it's going to have a couple of niche impacts on the building industry, but the technology's here to be able to 3D print large plastic components. So this is one we did for a cubby house pavilion at the garden show earlier in the year, and this so being able to build custom digital workflows right through to fabrication at RMIT. So we literally handed the robot operator at RMIT a toolpath rather than a 3D model. These are all the points. These are the 420,000 points your robot's going to go to in sequence, so please run it. And here that is. So this sort of integration across the various bits of digital technologies and tools that are there is where computational design starts to tie these together. I'm going to hand over to Richard now to quickly talk about some of our collaboration tools and GIS.
Thanks, Nick. My name's Richard, so I'm a senior GIS consultant at Aurecon. I've been working for Aurecon for around 10 years, so I've seen a bit throughout that time. Yep. I generally get pulled into large infrastructure, road and rail projects to sort of manage GIS information, spatial data, and documents and that sort of thing. So I'd just like to talk to you about a couple of case studies that I've been able to implement on a large infrastructure project here in Melbourne. So we typically would set up a WebGIS. We've got that technology available to us. With the WebGIS, we can just pull in spatial data from all different disciplines across the project. Ground services, design, survey, ecology and environmental information, aerial photography, LiDAR, all that sort of information. So it's just a really good place for everyone to go and look at what's going on across the project. It's good for people like project managers who perhaps don't have CAD software or anything like that, so they can just jump on and have a look. We're able to, as well as giving internal access to our team, give the client access through our security model. We can create custom applications to suit different users and teams across the project. We can secure layers and different sites to various users, so people aren't seeing what they don't need to see. And with our other collaboration tool in SharePoint, we can set up linkages between our spatial information and other non-spatial information such as photographs or borehole logs to provide a really seamless link between those two information repositories, I guess. So I'm going to talk about 3 case studies of actual examples where we've used both GIS and document management to provide a one-stop shop for certain information across the project. We had a problem. We were collecting a lot of information about buildings. This particular project is a tunnelling project, so it's very important to know structural details of buildings and whether there's basements and things like that. Three different organisations in a joint venture, as well as our client, were pulling in documents from stakeholders, various connections they've got across the industry, RFIs to local government and things like that. And we had a problem where we had a lot of documents, up in the order of 10,000 documents sitting in different systems. So we proposed that all this information should sit in SharePoint, and we would create a spatial front end to that information through a buildings layer. And so what that means is you can just go into the GIS, you can see where the information exists about a building, and you can click on that building and then go in and pull up any information that exists, whether it be an as-built document, a design drawing, photographs from a site investigation. And we also had a program of doing basement surveys, so we put all our basement survey drawings and models through that system as well. That's been a very valuable legacy piece of information for the project, and it'll be something that the client and the stakeholders can come back to in the future. Another thing we were able to do was our client became a planning authority, a referral authority. So we were able to create a GIS layer for them to be able to track planning applications that were coming to them. And this system is quite simple. It just enables the client to go in and change a few attributes about planning applications that came through for various buildings, and whether it was a planning application that had come in, whether it had been assessed or had been closed out, and that's just colour-coded through the map. So it's a very intuitive way of sort of really seeing quickly at a glance what planning applications were evident. And the final case study is the application of mobile GIS for the project. So our comms team, they wanted to go out and basically find out about various buildings, who the body corporate was for that building, so they could get in touch with the body corporate and also all the residents that lived at that building. So their initial approach was to go out with pen and paper, you guessed it. So when I heard about this, I said, oh, we can do a bit better than that. So using ArcGIS Collector, we're basically using an iPad. The comms team can now just go out in the field, click on a building, populate a few fields, drop down pick lists and things like that. They come back to the office. It's all in the cloud, so we just download a spreadsheet for them, and that's just saved them a lot of time. And it just means that there's no duplicate or typos that might get entered into the information, and just time-saving exercise. That's all I really wanted to talk about today. So summing up, the geospatial value creates efficiencies, allows visualisation of data from disparate disciplines, promotes understanding and awareness, and many of our clients are expecting it now, so we need to be prepared to do it. Thanks.
So you're seeing just across those two different perspectives, the many different ways in which we're beginning to see that transformation. So from those as case studies, we can see how our digital present is really pointing towards what our digital future might look like as an industry. So in Richard's case studies, already a number of instances where we've been able to leverage that identified value in disparate data sources being pulled together in a way that's much more accessible. For that to happen sensibly, that integration, needs to be, as seamless as possible. But just having it all in one place isn't necessarily enough. It has to be accessible. We have to be able to not just interrogate it, but work with it. So that user interface component is something which we shouldn't undervalue either. That's that point of engagement. And really to be able to do that effectively, we need to consider it as an experience. What is the experience for that user, that participant in accessing that information, in working with these systems, really, in order to be able to do something with that content, with that information. It needs to service their needs in ultimately them servicing their clients or enacting something within a project. Again, it's not the technology by itself which accomplishes that ultimate goal. It doesn't deliver the outcome without the person at the centre of it being able to utilise it and act upon it. In Nick's scenario, as a digital practice leader, we see that we're really having to address and take advantage of these opportunities to better understand our workflows and see how we can actually implement a more effective digital workflow that leverages these capabilities, throughout a project lifecycle, throughout a given function, as an end-to-end system, really. but the key actor in that system is the user of that content. So we can observe also then, with the availability of this content, better access to information, we can achieve the outcomes that we actually desire. But again, we don't need to take that as, or we don't need to consider that as a static process, but one which evolves. So really the need to, once, on this digital journey, to continue to innovate. Not just innovate the technology, but innovate the way in which we work with the technology. And fundamentally, that comes from being able to share not just the information, but the knowledge which we extract from that information. Right? Data by itself is worthless. Information by itself is, not as worthless, but it's still not the end game. It's what are you able to do with that information? What knowledge are you able to extract and then apply? So we're harnessing that notion of innovation through collaboration by really tapping into the expertise that sits not just across the organisation, but with the clients, amongst all of the participants in industry. How can we better generate innovative solutions? And that's largely by giving them air, by sharing them, getting that feedback, being able to assess the value, and begin that road of development to test rapidly, to become more agile. Again, it's a concept that we've heard earlier today and that we may intuitively just apply to a software development environment, but it's not necessarily the case. I think we're at a point in time where that kind of proactivity can be applied across many domains. So we get to the insights. So we've already heard from a number of people today that we're all sitting on a wealth of data and we can do all kinds of wonderful things with it. And then the question is how. But also, as we heard in one of the panel sessions, what needs to be done, almost in advance of this to make sure that the data is suitable for those downstream processes. So within Aurecon, we have a machine learning lab, which is in my domain. I'm from an electronics engineering background. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really about being able to undertake more effective analytics and ultimately optimization of processes or designs and ultimately solutions. Really leveraging not just the domain expertise that exists within different markets and in different parts of the industry, but leveraging the expertise that sits within other domains. And that might be mathematics, it might be different domains of engineering. And having that underpin how we adopt and utilise the capabilities around machine learning. So not treating that whole domain as a black box and something to be either feared or to be assumed will solve everything and do everything. Once again, we can really consider that genuinely as a toolkit, established by other experts, but something which we can use, which we can integrate, but again, which has our needs and I guess our role within that at the heart. So we've already been applying those kinds of methodologies in different areas of engineering, in optimizing mechanical processes, but equally in being able to operate on vast data sets of disparate nature in order to be able to, I guess, leverage what is at, the heart of machine learning, which is the capacity to process large volumes of data in order to establish underlying patterns which may not be initially evident or may just take an inordinate amount of time to process ordinarily. So we're not only applying that in the context of engineering design, but also in understanding business practice. Again, we can look to our own organisations as repositories of vast amounts of data. How can we undertake analytics on those processes, on those operations, to better understand how things are functioning, to better understand processes which we may have an intuitive understanding of, but which would benefit from being either validated or modelled in a way that perhaps lets us forecast, lets us adapt, lets us be more agile. So it's not just a question of number crunching. It's not just diving into an enormous spreadsheet and pushing through large numbers. But again, being able to, being able to visualise that content. So that diagram, all right, I'll just skip past that because that might be problematic. There we go. So the previous one was a sample of an organisational structure. By visualising it in a novel fashion, we can think about innovative ways in which to actually interrogate that data and perhaps better understand what's represented there and what some of those relationships are. This one here is, again, a different but an equally novel visualisation of expertise as it may sit around a larger organisation, and representing that expertise in novel fashions. So in this particular instance, it's linking multiple skill sets at any one time. So not looking at a given skill set in isolation, but what is the mapping across an organisation? What does that resource look like when you start to draw together relationships? And again, a novel visualisation gives us interesting ways in which we can not only interrogate it, but then begin to understand what we can do with that. So similarly, again, in mining all of this data that's available to us, some of that might be within our existing internal business systems. This is a particular example of looking at mobility around an organisation using, and there's any number of ways in which that kind of information can be collected or can be sourced, but this is just by virtue of Wi-Fi access points through devices carried around a given workplace. So from that, we might be able to infer things like connected networks, how people are collaborating, how an organisation is actually functioning across different teams or different areas of expertise. So there's a great number of possibilities that we can identify and explore and extract value from in looking more closely and implementing some of those analytics functions within our systems. So at the same time, we've been undertaking a collaboration with Aconex as well to see how we can apply similar sort of understanding and similar sort of perspectives to our project data. So again, from a kind of a signal processing and machine learning process, there's a great amount of information to be leveraged from historical content. Any kind of predictive analytics or forecasting is really done on the basis of some kind of representative history. That's how we train a machine. That's the sort of thing that AI is purporting to deliver. It's based on training data. So what can we learn from historical content that we could use to then forecast an event or a trend into the future ahead of time in order to allow us as engineers or as project managers or whatever the case may be to anticipate something, or at least be prepared to respond to events as we uncover them. So what do all these things start to present for us? Well, a bunch of new services. So this is where we kind of get into the fun stuff, you know, where we can start to explore not just what is the potential, but what it looks like implemented, how it's deployed, but again, not just a technology for its own sake. What is it then enabling us to do in that given workspace? So a really, straightforward one, of which there's no doubt other examples of, is highlights really the need for accessibility to that content, on an as-needs basis, but also in a mobile fashion. So it's not to say, well, here's another app, and an app will solve all your problems, because that's far from the case, and I think as soon as somebody tells you that is the case, step away. So this is one that just references QR codes as a way to be able to readily access a repository of technical documentation. So again, it's just one small piece of the puzzle that facilitates a new workflow, and in this instance then, a digital workflow. But for that to be really beneficial, all of that content has to be kind of, accessible in an organised fashion in the back end. So you really need to be on top of that information management that enables those front-end services. The other area which we've already undertaken a couple of interesting projects on has been utilising drones as data capture. And I point to these not as an evangelist for drones, as I heard somebody else mention earlier. From my perspective, that's just a mode of data capture. The real value is in what that enables you to do. Now, in our case, this was a project in Christchurch, so Dean's Head, which a number of years ago, as a result of the Christchurch earthquake, resulted in a number of landslides. That's a primary arterial to a number of townships further down the coast. So it's critical that that be maintained and protected. In the assessment of that cliff face and that environment, it was determined that a number of those houses that you see there were no longer stable, and the ones that were at too great a risk in the event of any subsequent earthquakes. So it was determined that that whole area would largely need to be excavated. So a new digital workflow was implemented that leveraged drones as a way of mapping that area. Now, the same thing could have been done with a helicopter flyover, but with that, more traditional means, comes a certain expense. So some internal innovation, leveraging an emerging technology, our engineers were able to capture that same information, stitch together a multitude of photographs, have that modelled and displayed in an online viewer. So in a way that in the first instance, saved an incredible cost to the client. So the client was extremely pleased just from the outset. So in this work for New Zealand Land Infrastructure, as a client, I guess they were also paying for the removal of that, those bulk materials. So for those bulk earthworks, we were able to repeat that data capture, model the terrain, and provide an alternative method for calculating the actual volume of excavations as a way to then validate the costs being incurred by the provider of those services. So again, another really valuable outcome for the client that stemmed from that initial innovation. So that's just in the data capture. what we're then able to do with that data is adapt that and apply it within the context of a virtual reality platform, which provides more than just novel gaming functionality. So in this instance, it allowed those engaging on the project to actually assess the environment as part of their work planning process, to be able to map and plan given activities in advance of going out on site, to be able to adapt strategies based on identifiable issues, but also to develop a familiarity with what was being undertaken. So an extension for that, and this comes back to that, the notion of technology enabling collaboration, we're able to apply that into an augmented reality environment as well, using the HoloLens. So in a similar way, enabling multiple people to come together in advance of the work being undertaken to have a more realistic representation of the environment, and so strategize the way in which that work was being undertaken. So you'll see there the excavators halfway up that cliff top were actually being operated via remote control because it was deemed unsafe for people to be working up in that environment. So this collection of, I guess, services that we were able to provide to the client and to the people undertaking the project work saved enormous costs, but also fundamentally provided a safer working environment in being able to provide appropriate strategies on the basis of richer information than would otherwise have been the case. We're probably wrapping up quickly, so this is another just quick example in Wynyard Station, leveraging user engagement tools, so augmented reality for stakeholder engagement, where the stakeholder is actually not the client in this case, but the consumer, the occupant of that environment, undertaken in the midst of construction works. At the same time, addressing cooling issues around stations, we were able to apply design-led thinking, 3D printing of air diffusers, and then test those within a given environment as a way of, I guess, optioneering and validating what some of those implementations might be, and test them first in a development environment, but then also in situ. So that last picture you see there was a deployment after last Christmas. So we can also extend virtual reality platforms as a way of design review, but also immersive training. So there's many functions which we can use to solve some of our more traditional engineering problems, but also identify new services and greater stakeholder engagement and awareness. So my last point, because I know we've gone probably a little bit over time and into our question, time is, I think as you think about your digital future, as we have in mapping ours, really that's underpinned by having an overarching strategy. And I think that begins with the recognition of the value in extracting historical data, addressing data collection to enable those future functions, but building that around domain expertise, exploring new modes of information capture in order to be able to extract those deeper insights. So it's not just collection for collection's sake, it's towards an objective of better understanding for better action. So taking a design-led approach to stakeholder engagement and fundamentally adopting a human-centered approach in not just adopting these technologies, but shaping them and how they are utilised within our workplace. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks.